I'm going to show you how to do a snowflake applique. Now I have patterns for snowflakes that are available in my Etsy store, and they would all make great appliques. The patterns come with instructions, so if you can't follow this, you can look into that. I'll put the address up for that at the end. I'm using today freezer paper, and the reason I'm doing that is because when I'm ready to transfer this, which this is going to become the snowflake, when I'm getting ready to transfer it to the fabric, I can just press it down and that'll hold it in place. And it comes in the right size. All my patterns mostly are for 18-inch snowflakes, and this is how big the freezer paper is. So, tear off a square. The shiny side is the down side, so right now put the shiny side up. And then fold over so that you get one of the edges to line up with the other. Now I didn't cut it perfectly square, so I've got some extra here. If you're wanting to be perfect, you can certainly measure so that you get an exact size to begin with, but I find this works just as well. It wastes a little bit of paper, but it's not a big deal. So now I have a big square. You want to fold your lines pretty tightly there. Might even help to run your fingernail across it. So it's a big square, shiny sides in. Now fold it again. Line up those edges. So now it's essentially folded in quarters. So if I were to open that up, you could see it's divided in 4. So that's the beginning. Now a snowflake has 6 points. If I fold this in half again, and in half again, I get 8 points. I want to make it 6. So in order to do that, what I have to do is start by, you're going to have to sort of estimate here, but I want to fold this over to something like this. Now it's hard to say exactly how far you need to fold it, because this and this need to be the same size. Now what I'm not folding it real hard and crisp yet, because now what I'm going to do is fold this piece over to here and just see if I got it. Now what it looks like to me is this is bunching up a little bit here, so that means I need to ease back just a touch. And now I should be able to fold it nice and solid and give those edges a run through so it's nice and crisp. So does that make sense? So it's, if I open it up, you can see that this edge comes right up to the fold now. So it looks like that. Now at this point is where, if you were going to use one of my patterns, you would actually trace that onto the back of this paper and then cut it out. I'm not going to use a pattern today because I want to keep it simple. So I wanted to show you that you can do it without a pattern. So first thing you do is cut it sort of on a diagonal, and that essentially gives you a big 6-pointed star. Now to make it a snowflake, we'll cut in. Now, be sure you're using paper scissors, not your sewing scissors, and I find a little tiny pair of scissors with a nice point is really the best for making a nice snowflake. I've been cutting these things out for years, so it doesn't take me a whole lot of thought to do it. And I'm keeping this one pretty simple just for demonstration, but you certainly could make them more or less complex, just whatever your preference is, and in this case, with however you feel up to sewing. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to do a satin stitch applique to hold it onto the fabric. You could also do a buttonhole, but you could also, if you wanted, do this with a fusible, and that would probably be a good idea if you're doing a real complex design. If you used a fusible, you wouldn't have to worry about the fabric as much, because the fusible would add a stability to it. So, and of course you would be able to just do it raw edge. You could just iron it on and be done. So, opening. Be careful not to tear it. You'll have to open it, kind of carefully. And there we have a snowflake. Now, if you were just doing this to be just a paper snowflake and wanting to stop right there, what I would do is press it. That's the best way to get all your lines out, all the creases out. So you would just use an iron and give it a good press. I'm going to see if my iron is hot here. What I'm going to do is I am going to, I've got some white fabric that I'm going to use to make the snowflake applique. Now, what I'll do is press the snowflake to the fabric. Now, I should have pressed my fabric first, but it'll be fine. So the sticky side, the shiny side of the freezer paper acts as an adhesive to temporarily attach that snowflake to the fabric. Now, if I was doing this with regular paper, not freezer paper, I wouldn't be able to press it down like this, and what I would then need to do is press the snowflake first, and then I would carefully line it up on top of the fabric and pin it in place, because the next step is going to be tracing the edges, the cut edges of the snowflake onto the fabric, and you're going to just carefully trace around the edges. Use whatever marking pencil you are comfortable with. I'm I'm using a Crayola washable marker, the kind they make for kids, and they have always washed out for me in the past. Here's hoping they will again. You could even use a pencil or any other, wash away type, or those iron out marking pencils would work fine for this. I don't advocate those for marking your quilting lines because they don't always completely disappear. They have a tendency to show up later. So I'll go around and I'll mark this whole thing, and I'll trace around all of it, and then using a small pair of scissors I will cut that out, and then I'll show you how I'm going to attach it to the fabric. I'm going to applique it onto a nice red fabric to make it kind of Christmassy. This will make about an 18-inch square, and I think I'll probably, well, you could do several things. It could be made into a full quilt. You could do several of these, or you could make them into individual items. I think this one will probably end up being a pillow. It'll make a nice pillow top, but again, it could easily be made into a full quilt. With 18-inch square blocks, you could do 3x4 and you'd have a nice big quilt. So I'm going to continue tracing, and then I will cut it out and I'll show you what we end up with next. Be right back. Okay, so here it is all traced out around the freezer paper, and again, this will just peel right off. You're gonna, if you want to save the snowflake, you'll have to peel a little carefully or it'll tear. But it comes right off. The nice thing about having it pressed down like that is that it really does keep the design in place. You don't have to worry about it sliding around and moving and causing distortion. So take a few minutes to peel it off, and then I don't know if that's even going to show up because it's kind of faint. I used a light colored marker. Yeah, I think it shows. So then the next step is to cut it out, and that is going to take a little time because you've got lots of little places to cut out. So be slow and steady. I like to cut just inside those lines so that I get all of those lines that I marked with cut off. So in case there's any chance that those don't come out, I don't have to worry about it because I'm cutting them off. So cut it all out, and then we'll move to the next step, which is doing the applique. I finished cutting out the snowflake, and I'll show you that in a minute. This is the fabric that I'm going to applique the snowflake onto. This is about the size of a fat quarter, and so That's all you would need for one of these larger snowflakes. What I did is I pressed some tearaway stabilizer, paper tearaway, to the back. That's going to make the stitching, the machine applique that I do, it's going to make it easier, keep it from puckering as much. So that's this. Now for the snowflake itself, here it is. Here's the paper, the freezer paper pattern, and there's the one that's cut out in fabric. I'm going to use temporary basting spray on the back of this, and that's what I'll attach it to the fabric with. I have a piece of junk fabric that I use for basting spray. Piece of newspaper or something will work. You just don't want to get this overspray of this all over your work surfaces. And work in a ventilated area. Read the instructions on the can. This is what I'm using is 505. It's available at most of your craft type and fabric type stores. I like it better than some of the other brands that I've tried because it isn't smelly. Most of the others that I've used are just horribly smelly. Now, unfortunately, I just glued it to itself. You're going to want to be careful when you move it around that you don't get it stuck to itself. So this is the back side with the tearaway stabilizer. I'm going to give it another quick press down here because I want to make sure it's stuck on. I didn't press it on as good as I thought I had. I could see it was coming loose. So, and this, after the stitching is done, I'll flip this over and this will just tear right off. So it's not going to cause any extra stiffness or anything in the fabric. It's going to help me when I do my stitching. So that's all that I need that for. I could do it without, and I've done it without, but I find that it's a little easier with it on there. So now to get the applique on, and this is probably the hardest part because it's so floppy that you're going to have to do a little maneuvering and adjusting and working at getting it to be in the position that you want it to be. So don't despair. It can be done. The spray is pretty repositionable for quite a while. So you've got some time, and it's actually easier to move it around after it's had a chance to set for a while. So spray it and let it set on the on its back before you get too carried away in trying to press it down so that you can manipulate it some. Now here's the problem. I'm too close to this bottom edge, so I'm actually going to have to move it. Don't want to have to do that, but rather than cut my points off, and that may seem like a lot of craziness, but it'll be fine. It's just a matter of getting it all unstuck from itself. And I probably could have been a little more careful when I moved it, and then it wouldn't have tangled up as much. But anyway, I think you can see that it is repositionable. So you could also do this with instead of the spray, you could use a glue stick. They sell glue sticks that are specific to basting, but a regular glue stick also would work. There's several different brands of glue basting that come in a squeeze bottle that would work fine. So use whatever method you're most comfortable with. So there, that positioning is better. Now I can just be sure that I get it nice and flat and press it down. And be sure you don't have any of your points folded under. Now, as I said, you could use fusible, which I can't think of a brand name because I don't use it that often, but it is you would get the kind that you peel off the paper backing and stick it on the back. And what I would do in that case is I would make my snowflake using the fold-up method that I showed you, and then you would trace that onto the fabric. Then you would put the fusible onto the back of the whole piece of fabric, and there's usually a paper piece that you peel off, and then you stick it down, and then you would cut out the fabric. And then you would take the finished cut out snowflake that has the fusible on the back. Then there's another layer of paper that you would peel off. Then you would center the whole thing on your fabric and then press it down. So anyway, different ways to do it. This is, I like this way because it doesn't add the extra thickness of the fusible, and I find even the thinnest fusible does tend to make the fabric a little stiff. But this temporary basting spray washes out. So anyway, so there's that, and now I'm ready to take it to the machine and applique it onto the fabric. So that's next. Okay, I'm ready to do the machine applique. Now because I like to use old machines, I've got one of my old vintage zigzag machines in the treadle, and you certainly don't have to use a treadle. This is just what I like to do. So I'm going to use a real densely packed zigzag stitch, which essentially that becomes a satin stitch. You could easily do on a more modern machine that has the stitch. You could do a blanket stitch, and that would work fine. You could use any number of different decorative stitches. I like the look of a zigzag stitch. So and you can adjust your stitch width to suit your preference. I like the treadle for a couple of reasons. One is that it's real easy for me to go slow, and slow moving, I have an easier time getting a nice finish. With this particular foot that I'm using, I find there is, and I don't know if it'll show, but right in the middle of the toe there's a line where it's open, and if I keep the edge of the fabric lined up with that, that helps me to stay on track and get the thing to line up the way I want it to. There is going to be a lot of turning involved because of all of the points. So this is going to take you a while, but it isn't hard. Oop, I went backwards. There we go. It isn't hard. It's just rather time consuming, and my advice is go nice and slow, and it'll turn out just fine. So the thing that you'll need to play with in the beginning before you get really going is do a sample of your stitches so that you can be sure that your stitch width is what you want, and also your stitch length. Obviously, if you make your stitches too far apart, it's going to look like zigzag stitches instead of a nice filled in stitch. And if you make your stitches too wide, it'll change the overall appearance. So you will have some adjusting to do, and some playing around with how far out to sew, and you know, how far you should stitch out to the points. And that always takes me a bit of figuring as I go to, you know, to get a nice point. That point didn't turn out too beautiful. It came out kind of rounded off. So you'll have to do a little practice. It'll get better as you go. I am using a polyester embroidery thread to do the stitching here, and that seems to be working well for me. So you can see the overall, and there it is on the back. And again, once I get it all stitched, that tearaway stabilizer will get torn off. So I'm going to continue stitching for a bit, and first thing I'm going to do is do this all the way around all the edges. Then I'm going to go in and do individually in the middle of all of these pieces. That's the part that's going to really take some time. So I'll be back in a bit. One thing that I wanted to mention as I'm doing this that I forgot to mention, when you're doing your stitching, part of the zigzag stitch will go onto the white fabric and part will go onto the background fabric, and it's going back and forth. What you want to keep in mind is you want, when that needle is in its farthest position to the left, you want it to be taking a pretty good bite out of the white fabric. You don't want those stitches to be right up against the edge. You want them to be in a bit, because that, if you're too close, you've only got a thread or two that's actually holding that applique down. So you need to get a decent bite of that fabric along this edge to be sure that this stitch is going to hold that fabric down, and it won't just all come undone. However you, whatever width you make that zigzag stitch, and whatever wherever you use as your guide to go along there, just make sure that you're getting a good enough bite into the applique, or it will not hold up. It won't hold itself on. So just be aware of that as you do your stitching, so that you're not having the whole thing come undone. The way I've got it set up is my needle in its farthest left position is going into the fabric, and its farthest right position, it's just barely missing the edge of that applique. And that you'll need to, every machine is going to be different, and your adjustment will be dependent on your machine. Mine is a very simple little lever on the top, and then it was just a matter of finding one of my, out of my collection of old feet, finding one that I felt like would work well for me. There are a whole bunch of feet available. Actually, this one's a nice one too because uh, it's got a bigger space there, and you may be able to see it better. Uh, I just like the other one a little better, having tried them both. This one just feels like it's easier to guide because the opening on this one is makes it easier, and it's also got this one has the same thing. But if you look at the base, do you see this indentation here? That makes the foot glide over the higher areas of the stitching better. So this style, and again this one has that too, that indentation makes the applique with a satin stitch easier to do. So whether it's this style or this style, look for something that has this kind of indentation in it. If you don't have one of those, if you just have a regular old zigzag foot, that's all you need. So I'll keeping at it, and I'll show you once I get the whole outside edge done, and we'll move on from there. I have all the edges on the outside stitched down, and what I'm going to do before I get in and do these inside pieces, I'm going to flip it over and tear off my stabilizer on the outside. It'll still be in the inside, so I won't have to worry about it, but right now it's just driving me crazy because it's making it harder to maneuver the fabric, which, you know, that's just because it's a little stiff. It will, I've got a big thread stuck from my machine. It will only take a minute to tear it off, and it'll just make life easier. I'm not going to be super careful about getting it all off right now, just the bulk of it around the outside edges, because like I said, it's now that I've got to do around the inside, it'll be easier if I have softer fabric to maneuver, and the tearaway just makes it a little stiff. So, and it comes off super easy. Now, you don't have to use tearaway stabilizer if you don't want. You can use one of the other kinds. They have a stabilizer that's a water soluble stabilizer, and then you just wash it out after you're done. I've not tried that kind because I'm just using up junk that I had, so that might even be better. I know some people who don't even use purchased stabilizer. They'll just iron a piece of freezer paper onto the back and then tear that off when it's done, and it seems to me that works fine. So use whatever you'd like. So now I've got the whole, well, maybe you can see that's the back all stitched down. Now I've got to come back and stitch around every one of these openings. Again, this is not a short project. It takes some time. The other thing I was thinking as I was doing this, I've always done this with an applique piece, but I could have traced that snowflake that we cut out directly onto this fabric and then only did the decorative stitch or the outline stitch or the satin stitch or whatever onto the fabric and not had the applique at all. That still would have given us an interesting pattern and would have made the snowflake look more delicate, I think, because it would have just been the lines instead of the full applique. So that's another way that you could do it, and it would save you the step of cutting out the applique and fusing it down. You could just trace your snowflake right onto the fabric and just do your outline stitching. So it's another option. And the other thing that you could do with your snowflake template that we cut this fabric out with, this could be used to trace onto your fabric in other places in your quilt, and you could use that as your quilting guide. So instead of having applique stitches here, this could be, you could do alternating blocks, or where one of them is appliqued and the other one is just a blank block, but then you trace this fabric onto it and just use that as your quilting design. So that, I think that would work too. So there's a lot of options of different ways that you can use this method of making a snowflake to incorporate into a quilt. As I said, several of these together would be a nice quilt. I'm actually, another thing I'm thinking about doing, I like the way this is looking. I might make it into the front of a tote bag. I think that'd be kind of neat. And certainly, because this is so big, this is an 18-inch block, you could, I have patterns for 9-inch available, so you could certainly make a much smaller one and use it for more other things. A couple of smaller ones together would make a kind of a neat placemat, I think. Maybe a big one and a couple of small ones on either side of it would make a good table runner. So lots of different ways you can use it. Anyway, my next step is to fill in the centers, and this part takes a long time because there's so many. Now, if you want to simplify the pattern, you certainly could do that so that there's not as many openings in the center, so there'd be less pieces to, to stitch around. It probably would make sense to do that rather than have 8 million. You might only have 500,000. Anyway, lots of different options for ways to do it. I've just got to fix my stitch length. There we go. So it's simply just like we did before. A lot of twists and turns to fill it all in. When I worked on the outside, I found that if I pivoted with my needle to the right of the fabric, I got a better corner. On the inside, I want to have the needle on the left when I pivot. So, as your needle moves back and forth, if you pivot with the needle as far into the fabric as it'll go, whether that be on the outside, it's to the right, and on the inside, it's to the left. That way, you don't get too far out of your shapes. On some of these, I got pretty good points, and some of them I didn't because I wasn't pivoting at the right spot. So, you want to be aware of that. One of the things that you learn as you do it is how your machine's going to behave and what's going to make it look the best. So, it's always a learning curve for me when I do a new thing. And another thing that always serves me well is remembering that you are making a handmade item, and it doesn't have to be perfect. stopping and starting, I do a few back stitches at the end. Not starting, but stopping. So there's one. Only a bazillion to go, so I'll keep at it. So I thought you might like to see the machine. That's an old Montgomery Ward machine, and it's in one of my treadles. So that's what we're up to, and just about got her done. A little bit more stitching around on the insides, and well, quite a bit more, but anyway, I think you can get the idea from that. So happy quilting.